So let's start with the life history of menstrual cycles. And think about that word, menstrual. Do you see what's in the center of menstrual? Menses, moon. Menstrual cycles were always recognized from ancient antiquity as having some relationship to the moon. I'm going to take you, if I can figure out how to get to slide, well, I'll do this one first. This is an array of 25,000 menstrual cycle years of data. Think about 25,000 dots are in this one figure. And what these authors did, and they published it in 1967, was show the variation of human menstrual cycles throughout reproductive life. Again, we're talking menses, fertility, reproduction. And what they showed was during the peak fertility years, the x-axis is age or stage of life, the y-axis is length of the menstrual cycle. Menstrual cycle, if a woman gets her period and starts bleeding January 1, it doesn't matter if she bleeds for 5 days or 10. If her next period comes January 30th, her cycle length is 29 days. That's the definition of a cycle length, from day 1 to just before the next day 1. What he showed was that the peak fertility years had an enormous tendency to have 29.5-day cycle lengths, with some variation around it. The darker the dots, the more women's data there were. And he showed that the 7 years before peak fertility, called puberty, and the 7 years at the end of fertile life, as women approach menopause and stop menstruating, are very similar mirror images of each other in the pattern of the cycle length. We're going to find out why cycle length means so much to me, right here with lunar cycles and fertility. I was collecting, as I will show you very soon, about ultimately 800 or 600 different women who contributed menstrual cycle calendars where they kept daily records and of when they bled for a semester. And they turned these calendars in usually by fax in those days. Do you still use a fax? Do you even know what a fax is? Sort of. You know what a scan is? You can scan something and send it. Well, we used to take a piece of paper and put it in a fax machine and put a telephone number to fax it to, and at the telephone's recipient telephone number, out came a copy of that piece of paper, like a photocopy. That was faxing. So we got all our data in those years by faxing. And what this is a graph of one of the discoveries I made along the way. I was collecting cycle data as a graduate student at Penn, and you'll see later why I was collecting it. But I had a woman professor in the biology department, and in that year, there were 49 faculty members, 50, and one woman professor and 48 men. And that one woman said to me, you know, Winnifred, you're collecting all these menstrual cycle data. Wouldn't it be interesting to see if there's any relationship to the moon and the moon cycle? And I thought that's great because I love looking at data and seeing patterns, because pattern recognition, for those of you who are mathematicians, you understand that in pattern recognition, you discover the truth of how things work. There's other ways to discover the truth, but pattern recognition is a terrific way. And what I did was I looked at the literature on the subject, and in those days we went into the basement of the Penn Library and got deeper and deeper down, floor below floor. The older the document was, the lower in the crypt it was. And I did find that in 1895, a paper was published evaluating lunar menstrual phase locking, and they said they couldn't find it. And the person who published that won the Nobel Prize for other work, but I studied his work and said he did the question wrong, and that's why he didn't find it. And so what I did is do the question and say, what if we only looked at women who had a cycle the same length as the moon? And asked, if there's nothing going along, those women will be arrayed all over the moon cycle the day they get their period. Some in the full moon, some in the new moon, some in the first quarter, some in the third quarter. This is the array of 68 women in the autumn of 1977 who all had an average cycle length of 29 days. And each day along the graph is the proportion of that group of 68 women that got their period that day. And what it showed was, as the full moon was approaching, the highest proportion were starting their period, and as the new moon was approaching, the lowest proportion. That would be sort of interesting, but what got really interesting is it replicated in 7 other years of data that were collected. And that was published, and this was, for me, earth-shaking to say, the sun and the moon and the stars that thou hast ordained, what's man? That thou's mindful of him, or the daughter of man, that the cycle is controlled by the moon. And I was pretty excited about that. You'll see sort of why soon.